Good morning, everyone, all members of European Guanxi, and good morning especially to you, Mirela. If it's okay, we can start the webinar about China and Eastern Europe's different trajectories in bilateral relations. Basically, what we will do in this webinar, we will chart aspects of the Central and Eastern Europe-China relationships across, well, economics as well as politics, cultural and personal dimensions. We will especially look at the 17+1 format that encompasses China's cooperation program with the CE region. CE region will be referred as Central Eastern Europe for future references. And we will point out its shortcomings as a multilateral forum, its drawbacks, its consequences. And well, we have the pleasure today to have here Mirela Petkova. Mirela Petkova is a former junior researcher at the EU and Global Affairs Unit. Her research focuses mainly on China's foreign policy, in particular China's global trade, if I'm not mistaken, investment infrastructure practices, and in this case, the Eastern Europe region and China relations. Mirela particularly has a Bachelor in International Relations and International Organizations from the University of Groningen, and has completed internships at the European Institute for Asian Studies in Belgium, I think, and at the administration of the President of the Republic of Bulgaria. And she's currently a data researcher for Energy Monitor, New Statesman's media group, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes.
Okay. So after this introduction, we will start with the presentation. But please, first of all, if you have any question during the webinar, please make sure to write personally to me on the chat, and we will discuss all these questions after Mirela has exposed her presentation. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Paul, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. I will share my screen now. Is my PowerPoint visible?
Yes, it is.
Wonderful. So we can start. So I think it's very important that we have those types of discussions on all levels, from the bureaucrats that are behind the EU to young practitioners that are dealing with China issues early in their career. And I'm looking very much forward to the discussion after my presentation on your views. How do you see that the cooperation between China and Eastern Europe has developed? Because obviously there are many opinions on that. I will be discussing the 17+1 format from a multilateral perspective, but I will also discuss two case studies, that being Serbia and the Czech Republic, and I will deal with more detail later why I've decided to focus on those two. But what I hope to achieve with this webinar is to show how many different trajectories emerged in the cooperation between China and countries from the region, and how any future analysis on China's foreign policy initiatives has to be rooted into the local knowledge of the regions in question, because the situation in which Chinese actors interact is very much shaped by the local interlocutors and their knowledge base. So I am unaware of your knowledge base in the sense of how many of you are aware of the cooperation, how many of you have worked on it. So it may be repetitive in the beginning, but bear with me. We need to start from scratch. 17+1 has been initiated in 2012 by China, and it entails the countries you see on the map. I'm not gonna name all of them, but basically you can break them down into the Baltics, the Visegrad 4, the Balkans, and Greece. And it's very hard to define it, just as it's hard to define, for example, China's global policy flagship project, the Belt and Road Initiative, because there has never been a description put out there by China. Instead, it has been based on very loose definitions of the win-win cooperation, boosted trade investment, and infrastructure cooperation. And those definitions are very easy to use by the countries, by many countries with different backgrounds, but they don't give us much to work with. Speaking of the BRI, I'm sure that all of you are aware that with its kickoff, Chinese engagements globally ventured into new territory. China was able to interact more with parts of the world with which it has never interacted before, 17+1 being a case in point. However, for the chronological point of view, it's important to remember that 17+1 was actually launched before the BRI, and it is not part of the BRI. So it is a separate concept on its own. It does get confusing, I have to admit, because there are certain projects in the region. For example, the Belgrade-Budapest railway between Serbia and Hungary, that is hailed as a BRI flagship project. So the distinction between such projects, it's very ambiguous. Are they part of the 17+1 or of the BRI or of both? It has to be looked at each case separately. Speaking of the format and how it differentiates from other regional groupings in which China participates, perhaps the thing that stands out the most is that the countries are not part of the developing world, because it's not unusual for China to have cooperation with countries from a certain region in the form of the +1 model, where China is the only external member. We've seen this with the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation and the Forum of China and Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. Those regional forums are quite often linked to Chinese policy banks, such as the China Development Bank and China Export-Import Bank, apologies, which finance most of the activities within those formats. Again, looking at the chronology of the project, while it was created in 2012, China was active in the region prior to that, most notably with its investments in the Piraeus port of Greece, which started in 2009, which is 3 years before 17+1 was launched and 4 years before BRI was launched. So Beijing's decision to institutionalize its relationship with countries from the region helped it mostly in the direction of giving it more publicity. The format accelerated its public visibility, public and official diplomacy with different ministers and head of governments and head of states from the region. They have been early meetings and shared guidelines for cooperation that outline the objectives and the progress of cooperation. Likewise, the stepping stone for the format has been set prior to Xi Jinping becoming the head of China in 2009 with a visit to Hungary when he was a vice president at the time, and in 2011 with a visit from former Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao. Even back then, China outlined the investment needs of the region and how it can serve as a stepping stone or a gateway, so to say, to European markets. So what I'm trying to say is that the cooperation has quite a lot of years and quite a lot of diplomatic and political exchanges under its belt, but nonetheless, it hasn't really worked. This multi-power cooperation, it has proved to be quite stagnant and insufficient in its attempts to develop any kind of community. In fact, I don't think we can speak of any kind of community because the interaction and the deals is mostly from China to a certain country in the region or a couple of countries tied together like Hungary and Serbia with the Belgrade-Budapest railway, but it is not from, let's say, Serbian investments to Hungary or to Romania. Which leads to that it's very difficult to find common objectives for the format, and that's why I would classify it as more of a talk shop than an actual multilateral cooperation, as it would be its official description. While it did push China in the limelight of the public discourse in the region and also in Western Europe, the format itself did not act as an accelerator for the deals. What I'm trying to say is that most deals were done bilaterally between China and Poland or China and Czech Republic. And this is true for Beijing basically any sector you can think of, from the infrastructure projects in the Balkans to the bank loans for lignite mines in Bosnia and Herzegovina, towards some greenfield and brownfield investments. It has always been between China and a specific country. Now here we see an analysis by choice, and we can see that since the establishment of the 16 plus, well, back then it was 16 plus 1, now it's 17 plus 1 platform in 2012, there have been no significant and tangible changes in the level of economic exchange between the countries. This analysis has broken down the CE region by 3 groups. So here we see the Visegrad 4 of Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia. Out of all the countries in the region, the Visegrad group has the highest level of both FDI and also trade volume. But if we look comparatively, from 2012 up until 2018, things haven't accelerated. They have stagnated, and the trade flows and the FDI stock have basically remained almost the same for all the countries in the Visegrad group. In the case of the Balkans, we do see clear favorites which are receiving most of the FDI. We also have to remember that some of the countries in the region are quite small, so that's another reason why they haven't received a huge portion of investments. But trade-wise, we can speak for the whole region that China constitutes a very small percentage of exports of the region. In 2019, it constituted 2% of the exports of Serbia, North Macedonia, and Albania, and 4% of Montenegro. With imports, we do see the higher numbers, but again, nothing significant. The average was 6% of imports to North Macedonia, up to 9% in Serbia. Those are the numbers for 2019. So the dynamics of the volume of exports and imports above shows that there's no direct trade exposure to China. And when we move over to the Baltics, it becomes really interesting because we see that the FDI there has been virtually non-existent. If we're looking for one sub-region into the whole grouping of the 17 countries, the Baltics would probably be the region that is most likely to put a halt on collaboration under the umbrella of 17 plus 1. And we have seen quite a lot of indications of that in the first months of 2021. Prior to the 17 plus 1 summit this year, the spokesman of the Estonian president said, and I quote, "We prefer using much more the EU 27 plus 1 format to address China via EU common policies." Then later on, just this week, some news leaked that Lithuania deliberated on whether to remain within the format or not. Foreign Minister Gabrielius Landsbergis said, and I quote, "I'm not saying that we're leaving and it's the end, but we should really consider what is a useful way of building a relationship with China." Now, I'm not going to delve too much into the Baltics because this is not my focus regions. And obviously, there are a lot of factors why relations with China there have been on a downward slope. But the fact that the grand rhetoric of investments didn't fulfill is surely a crucial factor here. Geopolitically, there's something very interesting that I believe China has largely overlooked the role of Russia, especially when it comes to the countries that are more to the east and have had more direct experience with Russia through their history. They are generally, not all of them, more likely to sideline with the West. And we've definitely seen that when it comes to the 5G network, with the push from the US for a clean network from Chinese 5G vendors such as Huawei. And in this sense, China's latecomer role is defining here, because not only its contemporary relations or contemporary relation with the countries hasn't proved to be too good, but there's also no historical base to work upon. whichever way we decide to measure it, China's approach has been very multifaceted, and it hasn't been similar in all of the countries, which sounds great until you realize that there have been countries that have been favored in terms of investments and projects, and others that have suffered promises that never became fulfilled. This has naturally resulted in bitterness in some countries in the Baltics, and it has created political linkages with countries that have been favored. Here on the graph, I thought is very interesting. I believe this is from the commercial agreements signed within the 17+1 summit. You can see Serbia and Hungary clearly being mentioned much more. Then we can see Greece, but with the other countries, it's very sparse. Either way, discussing China and Central and Eastern Europe through the lenses of 17+1, I think is not enough, because Central and Eastern Europe as a region is not uniform in a cultural, historic, and let alone a political or an economic sense. It's a group of very diverse countries, and we shouldn't also forget that there are countries in the region that are not part of the grouping. I think that's very interesting. We're talking here about Kosovo, Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine, which are significant countries in the region, but they are not part of the initiative for a variety of reasons. So treating the 17+1 as a block, it's incorrect. And I believe that in order to assess China's engagement, we have to look at the country level, at the bilateral relations. And here we can see two images. On the left, this is a billboard installed in Belgrade that reads "Hvala brate Si," thank you, brother Si. It has been installed after China sent medical supplies to Serbia in 2020 by Informer. This is one of the biggest tabloid names in Serbia, I believe, with over 100,000 copies in circulation. And on the right, we see Czech Senate leader Milos Vystrčić, who paid a visit to Taiwan in 2020 with over a delegation of over 90 members. And stood up to quite a lot of intimidation from China. Now, it may not be obvious at first why I've decided to compare those two when we talk about China and Eastern Europe, but from a comparative perspective, those are the countries that to me are representing the most different cases, the most different outcomes of how China has been received and treated in the region. And I mean, it is quite obvious because something happened there for a country to erect a billboard thanking Xi and a country to send its Senate leader to Taiwan. And I think it's very interesting to look at what exactly happened. One of the crucial distinctions that it's impossible to not mention it, even if we want to leave the EU outside of this conversation, is that the Czech Republic is a EU member state and Serbia is not. And the realities of that are very, very different because countries in the Western Balkans, Serbia here in particular, they have been experiencing this enlargement fatigue for quite some time due to how long and how difficult it has been to receive the membership. Czech Republic, on the other hand, it has been a member since 2004. It is not one of the founding members, but it has 17 years ahead, so to say. And why I mentioned the EU membership, I certainly don't want to play into the narrative of EU good, non-EU bad. I think that's very harmful, both for the EU and for non-member states. But what I mean is that EU membership does come with a certain strength of domestic institutions, whether it's the media or whether it's democratic institutions and the freedom of speech landscape, which in turn can be very important on how a country manages to insert itself into the public space of another. So here we see an index by Freedom House on the democracy percentage on each country. And I want to highlight the Czech Republic is no A+ student in democracy and rule of law either. That should be very clear. But I'm trying to make a comparison here. While Prague's score has stayed more or less the same in the last 5 years, we see Serbia's democracy percentage decreasing every single year. Apologies. So with this downward spiral of democracy, Serbia cannot be described anymore as a democracy. Freedom House actually describes it as a hybrid regime or one in transition. And it's very important to look at some of the at how the media landscape works, because the majority of Serbia's print media, whether it's print or electronic actually, is under the control of the ruling SNS party. At their worst, they put out propaganda that's in favor of the ruling party. In some cases, it's subtle, but in any case, it does leave very little space for opposition and for voices that are critical of the deals that the government is pursuing. What also contributes to the perfect storm of disinformation and fake news is the media literacy. There was a study by Open Society Institute Sofia that found that the ability of media consumers to identify and interpret disinformation is the lowest in Serbia out of Europe. This matters because bilateral relations with China have been what I would like to call the magnum opus of Alexander Vučić, the president, and his party, the SNS, because normalization talks with Kosovo have all but come to a halt, likewise with EU accession. But then China comes and China brings only benefits, or that's what the government puts out there, and then it's echoed by the media without any room for an actual discussion of the human rights record of the partner country or the environmental impact of certain investments that China has accumulated in Serbia. So this flawed media landscape has contributed to what you see in the bar chart by Deutsche Welle that's based on a survey by the Serbian Ministry of European Integration. There's quite a distorted view of foreign actors. So Serbians think China contributes almost as much as Russia and the EU to their economy, when in fact the EU has been the main investor. And of course, this is also highlighted by Serbia's relative lack of foreign investments and the need for public and private investments. And I believe China has understood that very well. I'll talk about the projects in the country in a second. But what I want to say is that China and Russia both are very present in the country. And that leaves a lot of leeway to Serbia when it comes to leverage, because it has the option of different foreign countries with which it can interact and it can receive benefits. And I understand that in the sense that if I was an autocrat like Vučić, and I knew that with my current style of government, getting into the EU and receiving those the money and everything that comes with EU membership is probably not happening soon, I would also be trying to diversify my my partnerships. But we also have to be careful not to blame everything on China, because Serbia has had this foreign policy, multi-vector foreign policy, I believe, ever since the mid 2000s, early 2000s. Don't quote me on the date. Where on one hand, it is participating in the European integration process, and on the other, it is maintaining very pragmatic relations with other actors, Russia at the time and now China. And this multi-vector foreign policy actually also has to do a lot with the media landscape, because if you are so close with so many actors, this does bring geopolitical insecurity, which in turn, it's very easy to fuel fake news, because there are a lot of foreign actors and there are agents within the country that are vying for the limelight in the press. So all those domestic circumstances, such as the freedom of media and foreign policy orientation, have certainly contributed to Serbia's friendship towards China. But I want to highlight very quickly what exactly are we talking about tangibly. Again, this may be familiar to some of you, but bear with me. I won't delve in too much. Militarily, it's very interesting because Serbia is the only European country that has purchased military equipment from China. We're talking about unmanned aerial vehicles, Chengdu Pterodactyl 1 drones. 9 of them were purchased in 2019, with 15 more in the pipeline. Serbia has also hosted joint police exercises with Chinese forces. Infrastructure-wise, for me, the two most significant projects are the Pupin Bridge over the Danube Belgrade. This one is complete. And the other project is still in construction. That's the Belgrade-Budapest Railway. There was a ton of controversy on that, whether it would be profitable and actually how many years it will take to be profitable. Lastly, and quite relevant to the situation we're in right now, 1.5 million vaccines have been delivered from China to Serbia. And this is a lot because Serbia's population is around 7 million. I'm not sure when was their last demographic poll done, but the population is around 7 million. And when you receive 1.5 million vaccines, that's quite remarkable. So China has obviously managed to build up a lot of political credit with Belgrade. And under those circumstances, and the current leadership in Belgrade, I don't see the situation changing anytime soon, deteriorating, not at all. Last year, Serbia aligned with only 57% of EU foreign policy declarations, down from 99% of harmonization in 2012. And again, not all that is China's fault, but we have to consider that opening up accession chapters will take quite some time. And the more the Serbian public has a positive view on China, the less likely it is that they will be pushing for joining the EU. Now, if we hop over to the Czech Republic, things look very differently. Similarly, things started very well. In fact, the period of 2013 up until 2017 is titled the Golden Age of Sino-Czech relations. If we look what happened domestically, there has been the Social Democrats Party, or the CCD, if I'm correct, that has emerged as, so to say, a very important link in the pro-China stance within the Czech Republic. They advocated for friendly relations with China based on, well, the economic benefits. But analysts from the region have actually linked this party to connections to the Chinese Communist Party even before the establishment of 17+1. And with time, this party has become a breeding center, so to say, for pro-China politicians. Case in point being one on the photo, Miloš Zeman, Czech president ever since 2013. He did embark on how to say it, a pivot to China in 2015. He was present on the parade for the Second World War. And in 2016, Xi Jinping paid the visit back. You can see them here enjoying nice beer in Prague. But what's more important than the beer is that at the time, Zeman declared that he would like for the Czech Republic to become the unsinkable, and I quote, unsinkable aircraft carrier of Chinese investment, end of quote. So during this visit, a strategic partnership was signed that accounted for around 11 billion euros of investment deals between the two countries. You can guess what happened. They didn't materialize. I believe around 1 billion euros materialized, but most of them were by a company titled CFC China Energy, which acted largely independently on its own and not and it wasn't a government-to-government initiative, so to say. It made quite a lot of acquisitions, a brewery, a finance group, the nation's largest football club, FC Slavia Praha. But again, most of the money that was pledged never came in. And it's not only about the money, it's also about the commitments you make and honoring them. And I believe that when this happens, when you pledge 11 billion and then don't honor your commitments, Czech decision makers felt very left down and misled. And this certainly gave an image of China as an unreliable partner within the Czech Republic. Beyond the economic realm, in 2018, the Czech cybersecurity agency issued a warning to private companies about Huawei due to its closeness with the Chinese state. And in another communication of the state here, it highlighted the rise of Chinese espionage activities within the Czech Republic. Following that, I think we're getting into something that's very significant. We can see how changes in local government and local circumstances can actually have an impact on relations with China. In 2019, Prague elected a new mayor of the city, Zdeněk Hryb. Apologies if I'm butchering that. He's from the Pirate Party, which has been, and this party positioned themselves as pro-Western and very progressive. And as Hryb assumed the office, he suggested that a city agreement that was conducted between Prague and Beijing in 2016 is revised. In particular, he wanted the clause acknowledging the One China policy removed. And you can imagine what happened from there. China didn't take this very lightly and started canceling cultural events within the Czech Republic, demanding that Hryb's position is removed. But long story short, this didn't happen, and the sister agreement between Prague and Beijing was cancelled. And as we saw in one of the previous posts, the Czech Senate leader did pay a visit to Taiwan. So when we talk about the Czech Republic, this was just a very brief summary. Obviously, there have been many other aspects of the relation, but it can be summarized in unfulfilled economic promises and a lot of political tension when it comes to Czech Republic voicing its opinion on issues that China takes close to heart, such as the One China policy. And while China has managed to get itself a high place on the political agenda, its influence strategy failed in the Czech Republic, for example, compared to Serbia. And in the beginning, I believe policymakers, we shouldn't look at their choice to cooperate with China as a decision to turn their back on the West. It's not that at all. It is a very normal political decision, I believe, for a small country to have to look for different economic partners. Now, oh, apologies. I mistook my slides. Let me see where I was. Right. So this actually comes to the point I wanted to make, and why at all I decided to focus on the bilateral level of a certain country, whether it's Czech Republic or Serbia. Certainly, there are shared similarities between the countries. For example, communism. All of them had been under communism rule in one way or another. And China's role as a communist state certainly has an effect on how citizens within the countries perceive it. But when we look at the divergent paths the Czech Republic and Serbia took, that is obviously not the main reason why it has been so different. And I believe the key here lies in how a nation perceives itself and how it has constructed its national identity. Because if the Czech Republic sees itself as a pro-democratic, pro-human rights, pro-Western country, this will be very well reflected in its policy towards China. And if we're talking about Serbia, then applying for EU membership and then calling Russians and Chinese brothers, it's not schizophrenic, because that's part of their national identity story that they're pitching out to the world. Now, ever since the format was started, I'm sure this is something, even if you're not following the debates on China and Eastern Europe, you have seen countries have been declared Trojan horses, sellouts, selling their souls to the devil, dividing the EU in exchange of juicy deals by Western pundits and also some US commenters. But obviously, as we have seen with the data, and I think it's now widely acknowledged, is that that's not the case. In fact, countries like the Czech Republic perhaps have been the most one of the most important actors for a constructive dialogue and debate on China and criticism, even compared to some of the bigger and more important member states like Germany and France that have different business interests. And I think that if we have to look at what place Eastern Europe deserves in European foreign policy, we have to well, not we, the EU has actually to make more consistent effort in including those countries in the dialogue and conversations with China. On the left, I've included, I believe, a photo from during the time Germany was having the presidency of the Council. And on the right, we have a very nice caricature from Choice that illustrates kind of the state of how the comprehensive investment agreement developed. A couple of days before it was official that the agreement will be concluded, I read a quote from the Polish Foreign Minister Zbigniew Frau that said that a good and balanced comprehensive agreement is better than a premature one, which indicates that perhaps there hasn't been a dialogue good enough with all the member states in order to represent all their interests. Obviously, this is very difficult with 27 member states, but you get my point. I do believe that Eastern European countries haven't been represented enough in the EU-wide debate on China. And if this is changed, EU's policy can be strengthened, because if those countries are not afraid to voice out their concerns in fears that their market access to China will be slashed or whatever, EU's dialogue can be more enriched. And it's very important to support them when they voice criticism on China and then China threatens to retaliate, which we have seen is quite possible. In October 2020, I believe, don't quote me on the date, Sweden decided to ban Chinese vendors in its 5G contracts, Huawei and ZTE. And then the Chinese ambassador said, and I quote, "Without doubt, this could have negative consequences for Swedish companies working in China." Or in the Czech case, specific Czech companies have been named and threatened in relation to the visit of the Czech Senate leader to Taiwan. Škoda Auto, Home Credit Group, Klaviry Petrov, those are, I don't know them either, what their business is, but those are the biggest Czech companies with the market in China. And it was said that they will have to pay for the chairman's visit to Taiwan. So obviously, in those instances, we're talking about a bilateral issue between Czech Republic and China, but it is still very important to show solidarity and support with your member states. Now, zooming out just for a second, I read this week a statement by the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, that China will be the geopolitical challenge of the 21st century. And well, that's not a new way of thinking for US policymakers. And this is certainly something that people that are working in the China field have been aware of for the last 15 to 20 years, perhaps even more. I don't have a memory of the period before that. But what makes me the impression is that there's a lot of talk about the problems of China's rise, China's foreign policy involvement and attempts to influence countries, and very little talk on how to actually deal with that. And what I hope I highlighted so far is that we have to pay, and with we, I mean whether it's young scholars that are doing research or European bureaucrats that are actually dealing with the policies in the making, there has to be much more attention paid to the domestic circumstances in the countries in which China is being active, and how it can be worked with those, and what we have to consider. For example, how is the democracy there, and whether their foreign policy is similar to Serbia, which is very much open to many different partnerships. And this is no panacea to dealing with China, but I do believe it's a good place to start. And with that, I would like to conclude the presentation section of this webinar and give the floor to Paul and welcome any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Mirela. It has been really an interesting topic to tackle, and yeah, Patricia also congratulates you and everyone from European Guanxi. Well, we'll give the floor to the questions. I'll start with one question we actually discussed before, and I'd like I really liked how which are the asymmetries and the differences between, for example, countries that are in Central and Eastern Europe and aren't part of the, for example, I think Kosovo, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova aren't part of this 17+1 system of cooperation, and which are the implications that this gives to these regions. And also, if you could tackle, for example, which are the differences in countries that are from these regions and are part of the European Union and countries which are not part of the European Union. So if you could,
can you just repeat the second part? So I got the part about Kosovo and Belarus, but
okay. And the second one was, for example, countries that are part of the European Union, if they present differences relating to China in relation to countries that are not part of the European Union, which are the differences and the asymmetries between all these countries? Well, it's quite a long question. You can shorten the question if you want to, but I think, well.
But that's a great question, you know, because when I was developing the topic, I was obviously I had to make the choice which case studies to include, whether it's Czech Republic and Serbia, or I myself am from Bulgaria, and I would have loved to do something on Bulgaria, but the reality is there's not much going on with China. But to your question, are there differences within EU member states? Definitely. And when we talk about EU member states that are China negative, definitely we've seen the Czech Republic. But if we want to pick a country that has demonstrated the most China positive behavior, then I think that's quite easy. That's Hungary. So why has this happened? Someone can ask if it's an EU member state and so on. I think it's very simplistic answer, but at the same time, it also reflects on what I mentioned on Serbia. Hungary has a very flawed democratic system. In fact, it has been, democracy has also been backsliding in the last years. And I think that has fueled a certain climate within the country where, again, cooperation with China is one of the greatest achievements of Orban. He may be on bad terms with the EU, but investments from China, I think they even recently opened a new university in Budapest. So relations with the EU may be going downwards, but the relations with China are amazing. Everything's great. We get the money, we get the financing, and that works well with their image and with presenting themselves to the domestic public. Now, with the countries that are part of, to your first question, countries that are geographically and culturally in Eastern Europe, but are not part of the format, those are Kosovo, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. And obviously, they are quite diverse because Kosovo, it's well, quite far away from the other three. But I think why Kosovo is not in the 17+1 format is the easiest question to answer, because China doesn't recognize Kosovo, and I don't assume it will ever will because of its relations with Serbia. But the other three are very interesting because China does have activities in those countries, and they are not of minor scale, at least in Belarus. For example, there is the industrial park right outside of Minsk, which I believe serves as an incubator, so to say, for businesses and firms. But China has still decided not to include, for example, Belarus in this format. And well, I can only guess what the reasoning behind this has been, but I would say first, there's definitely the Russia factor, because those countries are much more those countries' history is much more intertwined with Russia than, let's say, others. And second, the countries in the 17+1 format, yes, they're quite diverse, but they are either EU member states or EU candidate member states, while Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova are not.
Thank you very much. I was expecting a question from Patricia, so.
Thank you, Pau. First of all, thank you, Mirela, for this wonderful presentation. At European Guanxi, we are very glad for this opportunity. Thank you, Pau, for moderating it, and thank you, Laura Pipitone and Valerie Fappani, members of the webinars team, for making this possible. I'm going to ask you directly this question, Mirela. Do you think it is dangerous for the European Union that some of the member states that are part of the 17+1 format are using their relations with China as a leverage to defend their interests in Brussels? Thank you.
Give me a second to think. So you're asking if it's dangerous for the EU?
Exactly, yeah.
Sure, of course. But then if you look at it from a perspective of the member states, I don't think they're doing anything wrong. Of course, the problem is China's, the nature of the foreign actor. It's human rights practices and its environmental record and the way it finances projects. But if we're just talking about countries within the EU that are expanding their diplomatic connections and economic connections, I think that is something that the EU shouldn't frown upon, because obviously it helps your member states. But when it comes to using China as a leverage in Brussels, I do think it is dangerous, but it also depends on the way that the EU responds to that. Because as I outlined, if you begin attacking those countries as it was in the beginning when the format was created, you're antagonizing them and you're infantilizing them, in the sense that you're telling them you cannot have those separate diplomatic or economic relations on your own. Oh, but the EU can have relations with China. In fact, we're going to sign this comprehensive agreement, but you can't do it. So it is dangerous, but I think it could be more dangerous how Brussels reacts. It has to be done with tact and with the complete understanding that well, countries are free to do whatever they like, and different actors vie for their attention.
Thank you, Mirela.
We had a question from, I think, yes, Tom Sari asked a question about since the Hungarian party Fidesz left the governing EPP faction, well, it was just 2 days ago, which is more or less, sorry, I think I need to read first.
It's okay.
Okay, so the question is basically, so as that happened, do you think that Hungary will have a stronger pivot to China? Well, it's kind of related to Alicia asked, but do you think specifically Hungary could lead this case of pivoting towards China in relating to other Central Eastern countries? Well, if it could lead the way, kind of, yeah.
I think so. So maybe in the early days of 17+1, it wasn't exactly clear which EU member state will, as you said, lead the way, because Czech Republic did have very positive relations with China during the golden age. But with time, it has become quite visible that Hungary stands out in this sense. And it's not only that it's having warm feelings towards China, but it is also receiving things in return. Like I mentioned, the university that China is opening now in Hungary, the Belgrade-Budapest railway that is still being constructed. So I do believe that Hungary has no reason to take a different turn on its relations with China, and especially with, as the person that asked the question, Tom, I believe, outlined, the role of Fidesz is very important, because we saw this with, for example, the city of Prague. When leadership changes, it's very likely that there will be changes into the foreign policy as well. But with Fidesz, I don't see this changing soon. They've quite cemented their role, and I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. We also have a quick question from Mauro, and he was asking if what do you think about Furan opening a branch in Hungary? What do you think about this kind of soft power? And
so to be completely fair, I haven't followed the news too much. I just saw its opening, but definitely it can be connected to the issue of soft power, because it is similar to, for example, how the Confucius Institutes started. You have one thing opening in one country, but who can guarantee that this will be the only university or university branch in Eastern Europe? It may come a period when there's one in each country similar to the Confucius Institutes. Well, not soon for sure. But what this means for the host country and the way China practices its soft power, I believe, is that it is definitely a way of doing that, and it's not so much aimed, let's say, even at politicians, but at the general public and the students that study there and that interact with the university.
Perfect. We have we'll entertain the last question from Ana Robert. She was asking, well, it's kind of a long question and it needs a strong answer. So it's basically that Hungary and Poland, well, we see that Hungary is the center of the questions, but as we see that Hungary and Poland are increasingly approaching China in certain issues, well, Elena was referring to human rights abuses or kind of democratically speaking, and to what extent would you consider a dismantlement of the V4 group at the EU level, and even if it's possible a Brexit to happen in the future years? Or
okay,
it's kind of a strong topic, but
no, definitely. I mean, with Poland and Hungary, I didn't mention Poland quite a lot, but obviously they are still quite, they have their own problems with democracy. But whether they will, well, let's not call it a Brexit, but whether they will opt for stronger cooperation with China compared to the EU, I don't think so, because how I see their economic exchanges with China is, well, not putting all their eggs in one basket, because sure, they do get the EU funding, but what happens with the EU funding if their rule of law deteriorates so much that the EU decides to stop some portion of that funding? And obviously, I didn't mention something very important, but I do hope most of you are aware with that. Well, EU funding comes with a lot of conditionality and a lot of work, while on the Chinese side, that's definitely not the case. So cooperation with China is a very not easy thing to do, but it's an easier thing to pursue. And I think we will continue to be in this situation of EU membership combined with a lot of interaction with China in the near future, until bigger changes happen, such as, for example, change in ruling government domestically. For example, if Fidesz is ousted and a completely pro-Western government comes, that's again fully into the territory of prognosis and predictions. But if this happens, yes, then we can expect that things will take a different turn. But at the current situation, no.
thank you very much. Yeah, I imagine those were big words. So we will not entertain more questions. I'm sorry, the time it is what it is, and we will take one time to do some questions about what do you all members and you as a speaking. What do you think? What will happen in the future with all these problematics that pose the cooperation between the 70+1 and China? Laura, I think, Laura, are you there? Okay.
Yes.
So basically what we'll do is answer these questions, and yeah, it's for the newsletter of European Guanxi. So thank you all for the participation.
Thank you all very much for attending.